Welcome to yet another episode of Calloused podcast. So last week we discussed Philemon, and it was a really good lesson. I thoroughly enjoyed it a lot, and this week we are discussing Christian slavery in Rome. There is a few topics regarding Christian slavery in Rome that are a little bit adult in nature, but we're going to handle them um, with grace. I guess this is the best way to say it. So, um, one of the biggest things that I uh, came across, which actually before we get into that, we're just going to go to the Wikipedia real quick to start things off, as I'm a little close quartered with my camera stand, and so I accidentally kicked it. For those of you who are watching the video version of this, which also I accidentally messed up the video version of this last week. I had the frame, my phone vertical instead of horizontal, and so made editing kind of interesting. Um, so immediately, one of the things that Google chose to highlight for me in the Wikipedia text, because I can't think of what else to say at the moment. In antiquity, slavery was seen as the political consequence of one group dominating another, and people of any race, ethnicity, or place of origin might become slaves, including freeborn Romans. Slavery was practiced within all communities of the Roman Empire, including among Jews and Christians. Even modest households might expect to have 2 or 3 slaves. So it was a common thing, and a lot of times it was debt related. So one thing that I wanted to go over at all levels of employment, free work. Oh, well, actually, let me go ahead and start with the paragraph above that. Slavery played an important role in the society and economy of ancient Rome. Unskilled or low skill slaves labored in the fields, mines, and mills with few opportunities for advancement and little chance of freedom. Skilled and educated slaves, including artisans, chefs, domestic staff, and personnel attendants, entertainers, business managers, accountants, bankers, educators at all levels, secretaries and librarians, civil servants, and physicians occupied a more privileged tier. So even doctors were slaves. Uh, this whole idea of how slavery worked in the Roman world uh, intrigues me, because it was not like how we had it here in America in the time that slavery was here, but like jobs that we would not expect being held by a slave. A doctor. Like what? So an educated person essentially being a slave. It baffles me to no end. Uh let's see. Occupied a more privileged tier of servitude and could hope to obtain freedom through one of several well-defined paths with protections under the law. So there were laws to help you potentially become freed if you were in one of the skilled positions. So something to think about. The possibility of manumission and subsequent citizenship was a distinguishing feature of Rome's system of slavery, resulting in a significant and influential number of freed persons in Roman society. At all levels of employment, free working people, former slaves, and the enslaved mostly did the same kinds of jobs. So there would be a mixture of free and slaves that would do similar jobs. Elite Romans, whose wealth came from property ownership, saw little difference between slavery and a dependence on earning wages from labor. Slaves were themselves considered property under Roman law and had no rights of legal personhood. Unlike Roman citizens, by law, they could be subject to corporal punishment. We will label that as physical exploitation, if you know what I mean. Torture and summary execution. The most brutal forms of punishment were reserved for slaves. The adequacy of their diet, shelter, clothing, and healthcare was dependent on their perceived utility to owners whose impulses might be cruel or situationally humane. So I want to stop there for a minute because I was wanting to address the uh, intimate nature of the physical rights being revoked uh, from slaves. So basically, they could do whatever they wanted with you under Roman law. So that being said, as a Christian, that's tough. And so early on in the church, they were essentially trying to not necessarily abolish slavery, but they were trying to make it more humane, I guess, would be the term to use there. They didn't want those kinds of things happening. They didn't want people being beaten, obviously, and whatnot. But there wasn't like this issue with slavery, and we kind of saw that last week whenever we were looking at Philemon, and I honestly think that was good to lead with that. My original idea was to lead with this episode and then be like, but there is positives that we can focus on, but we've seen the positives, and now we can kind of look at this and see what really went down. We knew obviously from the previous episode that beatings and everything was okay, and one thing that I still can't wrap my head around is, you know, there being, because whenever we think of slavery again, and maybe this is just me, but I think overall the way it's painted for us is house help. Like here in America, this is the general view, at least from my experience. House help, working in fields, just like physical general labor, not skilled jobs. People in the house may have had more skilled, I guess, so to speak, from cooking to child care to whatever. So there's already a difference there, but there was still obviously brutality towards slaves uh, from what we see with what was going on in the Roman world. That's, I mean, the whole thing's a lot to take in because owning slaves, like owning another person, is such a tough subject. It is not an easy one to tackle. Let's see. I wanted to go to this. I think it was this one. Yes, because this fact here I found very interesting. So slavery in Greco-Roman culture. This is from drivenbygrace.com. So you may want to. I do believe we will put, like we'll want to do some chew and spit method here most likely. In the Greco-Roman culture, over 1/3 to 1/2 of the population were slaves. It's a lot of slaves. There were two types of slaves: domestic slaves and public slaves. A domestic slave was a person who worked for a master, typically in a home setting. Domestic slaves were generally treated better than those in the agricultural setting, and definitely better than those in the mines. Slaves in the domestic setting were expected to complete their task without being seen or heard. A public slave was a person who worked as a civil servant for the state. So basically, you were owned by Rome. For example, a public slave would provide free labor as a police officer, doctor, educator, accountant, etc. So now we have a bit better of an understanding of what that position looked like now that we're off of the Wikipedia page. The majority of the people became slaves from being a prisoner of war. When cities were conquered, they would take the people captive and sell them into slavery. Children born, so a way for the nation. I don't necessarily want to use the term government, but I guess so the government has a way of making money outside of taxes. So children born from a mother enslaved, this is a commonality that we saw with American slavery, right? When cities, so children born from a mother enslaved would inherently become slaves to her master. People could also become a slave by a way of clearing a debt or crime, which is what we had talked about earlier. Obviously, like if you're a prisoner of war, you're not getting out of that. You are then a slave for life. The slavery in this culture was not based on race or ethnicity. Anyone could become a slave. There was no partiality. Slavery was a critical aspect to the function of their society. They survived and thrived on the free labor of people. That is, there's just a lot to take in there. So the price to purchase a slave depended on their gender, education, and skill set. The cost of a slave could range from 500 denarii to 6,000 denarii. To put that into perspective, one denarius was a day's wage, so 300 denarii was about a year's full wage. As you can see, slaves were expensive. And the more elite people in society could afford more slaves and more skilled workers. Highly skilled slaves would consist of educated slaves for tutoring positions, specialty cooks, and even hairdressers. So there's a hierarchy of a Roman household. Okay, so you have sons. Oh, so at the very tip top, because it's like a triangle. At the very tip top, you have the head of household. Then you have sons. Then you have daughters. Then you have clients, citizens, and freemen. Then you have freedmen, which is slaves set free by master, and then slaves no rights. The head of the household was the eldest man, known as the paterfamilias. He was wealthy, and everyone was under his provisions. The paterfamilias' sons and daughters were the next highest ranking in the household. Clients were freemen with Roman rights, but they served the paterfamilias as a way of protection and provision. Freedmen were slaves that were set free by their owner and received some rights in society. However, they were still legally tied to the master's household. The lowest ranking was a slave who had absolutely zero rights in society. Treatment of a slave was dependent on the master. The treatment of slaves was terrible. Women would often be sold for intimate purposes, being treated like property for intimate pleasure. Women would serve other women by doing hair, makeup, or becoming a wet nurse. It was common for slave owners to. Sorry, I just hit a heavy spot in this lesson. Uh, it was common for slave owners to impregnate their female slaves in order to build their slave count. Any child a slave woman had was legal property of her owner. A child born by a slave mother was automatically enslaved, which we had already discussed, which honestly would imply, with some of the things that we had already talked about, that a slave owner would do that. But how could you do that to your child? How could you be okay with? It just shows you the lack of morality. And there's definitely a lack of morality today. It's all around us. It's definitely visible. And that one caught me by a little bit of surprise. I'm not gonna lie. God, Jesus, you know, the Godhead, loved us so much that our God came down into human form and went to the cross for us. Went to the cross for these people that we're reading about now in history that did these things. And how often did he use terms bondservant, slavery, uh, all those different things? This was common stuff for them. And I think in a way, mentally, we're so far removed from this that some of it gets lost in it, whether it's lost in translation, uh, being so far from removed from it, we can't comprehend it, what have you. Do we like we obviously look at God like our Father, Christ like our King and our brother, who is sharing His inheritance with us. But do we look at it as if we are bondservants? We're freed from slavery or from sin as Christians, but how do we view our role with our God? Because He paid the debt for us. Yet, as Christians, we are expected to work. And so I need to do my part. We need to do our part. And I hope this lesson gives you guys a different view on this than what you had originally. I know it's definitely changed mine, like within just a few minutes, because that was, I can't imagine doing that to my own child. Although I also can't imagine sacrificing my own child for somebody else. I would sacrifice myself, which essentially, obviously Christ is the Son or what have you, but they're still one. Because he went to the cross, we should want to work. We're here to labor in our master's vineyard, right? And I'm summarizing a lot. And the pace of this video definitely changed a lot after that, so I apologize. How do you think Paul taught, or like, not Paul? Well, I mean, obviously, like Paul wrote Philemon, so like that's why I said what I said. But how do you think Philemon taught, like not taught, treated? That was really hard to say. Treated his female slaves. Here we have a Christian brother owning other people. Again, it was the culture, as we've seen. Does that make it right? No, but that's what it was for the time. We can't go back and chastise Philemon. How dare you? But hopefully, Philemon did what was right and treated them all fairly, including and especially the women. So if you were to Google it yourself, you would. How do I get rid of that window? There we go. You would come across, like if you were to Google this, Christian slavery in Rome, it would say initial stance, which I already summed up for you guys, but I'm going to read it again anyways. The early church didn't challenge the institution of slavery as it was the backbone of the economy, but rather aimed to reform it by advising masters to treat slaves with kindness. We see that in Philemon. But I don't think that that's the only example that we have, but it's a great example. It's a biblical example. Social dynamics. Christians were both owners and owners of slaves, like we saw in Philemon. Some early leaders were formerly enslaved. They list a pope in this case. But I really am trying to focus more like prior to the establishment of Catholicism. We'll get into Constantine and all that later on, like we had planned. So I'm even going to skip over the legal changes for now, because that's under the under Constantine. So later reforms under Justinian. I wonder if that comes after the after 313 AD. It would have to. So, influence on treatment. Christian teachings aimed to curb the often intimate abuse of slaves by their masters, particularly by promoting monogamous relationships and intimate restraint. I hate using the word intimate for that, but I'm trying to keep it somewhat family rated in a sense, just because you may be listening to this in the car or while you're doing something in the household. You may not be having headphones on or by yourself while listening to this. So I'm trying to keep that in mind while conveying truth. Where's the other thing that I wanted to go over? Looking for the particular website. Well, there's this one. I don't think this was it. Here we go. Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24. We're going to begin to wrap this up. Okay, starting in verse 17 of 1 Corinthians 7. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman. It uses the, not freed man, but freedman. It uses the term that we had already discussed, which is good because now whenever you go to look at this section, you will have that understanding of that word, of the Lord. So again, we have, it paints that picture for us of where we are on that triangle. We have some rights as Christians. So it shows us where we are with that, which I find incredibly interesting. So I'm trying to put into words what I'm thinking here, and I am struggling very hard. Let's finish up what it says though. So likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. So puts you back in a different spot if you were free beforehand, because now you have these rules that you really have to follow, kind of putting those slave owners in that Philemon box, for lack of a better term. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. So, very heavy section there. Of course, this is a heavy subject, and I think it's important that we keep in mind, now that we know it, that triangle. But we're so blessed to live in the time that we live in, to have all these writings collected together in one book, made up of several other books. I just felt the urge to say that. So, okay, in other passages, and then what we just read is in parentheses, Paul urges slaves, and this is from Bible Talk, urges slaves to accept their present situation, but if the opportunity to gain their freedom comes up, they should take their freedom. Which, we saw that in parentheses whenever we were reading it. Paul's approach to this social evil was not to start a movement or to use violence to attack the established order of things. He worked through the church in providing God's word and will on this issue. Okay, so this is where we're going to wrap things up for tonight, or today. I'm recording it at night. As Christians, we have to handle things a specific way. Christ came and was peaceful. He didn't incite riots. He didn't incite revolutions. He didn't incite chaos. He handled things peacefully. That's why I've said the things that I have said in the past about using legislation where we can, speaking where we can, doing things like this, having these discussions right now. Not only doing this podcast, but hopefully in my day-to-day life, being an example of Christ and talking about him and everything, I hope that people see what I strive to be, that example that I'm hoping to set, that I'm aiming to set, that I do fall short on. I will call myself out 100% on it. I do fall short on it. But that being said, we need to be peaceful because Christ was peaceful. In any opportunity that we have, we need to try to do things peaceably. Like I've repeated a million times right here in this little section. But whenever things get tough, I know God's got me. Like, that's how I've always said it. However, a friend of mine said it in the way that God is still sovereign, which is very true. So whenever I see gas prices and I begin to feel a certain type of way, I remember God is still sovereign. It's not mine anyways, right? Render unto Caesar's. Whenever I'm taxed to no end, I can vote on it and I can say my piece. Should a revolution start? I know what I want to do as an American, but my nationality is not of this world, and so that makes it tough. Again, it's not mine, and I can't take it with me when I go. So, what do I do? What do you do? Something to ponder on for the next 7 days before we come back to the next episode of Calloused Hands. Remember, like I just said, God is sovereign. God is good. Be that light. Try to handle things a little bit more peaceably. And, we're a freedman no matter what we do. Hopefully that helps your walk with God. Hopefully you've grown closer to Him through this. And if you have any questions, comments, whatever, please reach out to us. And we will see you right here next week on Calloused Hands Podcast.